Hey, welcome back to the Papers Podcast. All the health professions education literature that you need is here. And the crew is assembled, the team, the squad, the minor intellectual giants in their own mind. All of us are here. I got Linda.
Hi, everybody.
I got Lara.
Hey, y'all.
And I got John. And by the way, last episode, I mentioned that maybe John and I played hockey together. And it was quite a sight. There's video. I'll be accompanying John's paper with the video. But take it away, John.
Jason, you were a phenomenon on the ice. I'll leave it ambiguous to determine whether that's positive or negative. I will say, though, in response to that, I went to the gym today and decided to do lower body workout to say, you know what, I need to keep up with the good Dr. Frank. And so I'm going to be firmly ensconced in this chair, probably not able to move because my legs have decided that's it. Deadlifting and squats are enough and maybe not a good idea before I sit in this chair for 2 hours of recording. Let's transition from Jason's tomfoolery to something that people actually subscribe to. The other podcast that we run where we go through the minutia of our everyday, not well subscribed to. I don't know why. I've been thinking this week about what's the spectrum, what's the scope of the things that we cover here on the pod. And I did a little ethno-subjective, quasi-experimental thematic auto-crossover non-equivalent thematic analysis. Insert Varpio's head exploding.
I love how you used all of Varpio's words all in one sentence.
I did. I put him into a blender and said, pop him out and give me something.
No.
Anyway, here's my opinion on some of the stuff we cover, which is, you're not going to be surprised to hear that I love tech and I love experiments. And if there's stats, even the better. But I'm not good at either. So that's what's that. Linda, you're our professional identity person. And then Laura, you keep us grounded. See what I did there? Did you get that one? That was good. That was good. I got to tell you, JF, I am just it's every bit of my prefrontal cortex not to take a cheap shot at you. Calm motion, deep breath. But I think you like a lot of the policy and system design stuff.
I do.
But if I was going to rewind the clock a little bit and say, what got me into health professions education? Where did my own journey start? It was that desire to become a better teacher. In fact, my graduate thesis was on a workshop-based innovative curriculum that, maybe innovative is a little bit of a stretch, that looked to reorganize how we could deliver teaching in a very practical way to clinicians in practice. And so I kind of want to use that as a rationale for returning to what I'm going to call the essentials, the literature that supports what we do as teachers, which is probably one of the fundamental characteristics or pieces of our professional identity that informs who we are as researchers and as clinician educators. So I went to a journal that I've never heard of before. It's called the Journal of Effective Teaching Methods, JETM. I love that abbreviation. And I love a little abbreviation here and there. It's published by the European Institute of Knowledge and Innovation. It is not a predatory journal. I did a bit of background to make sure that I wasn't promoting someone that's going to spam your inbox. So don't worry, we're not doing that. But it's a scientist-founded independent academic organization from Europe that promotes professional development and continuing education. Now, before we dive into that article, and I'm going to leave a bit of a cliffhanger, not naming the article, I'd like to hear a little bit about the foundational literature that's shaped our own roles as educators. So, Jason, Lara, Linda, what's an innovative instructional method you've used, or what's something you'll never try after you gave it a first kick and realize, oof, that's a solid 0? Or is there something that's frustrating you as a teacher right now that requires an innovation? Should we have some kind of hackathon motivated from our audience to solve something and produce an innovation? What say you?
Oh my goodness. I have a lot of things in your second column, things that I've messed up that I'm not a master of in terms of teaching. But I want to mention one that, I've introduced a few years ago that I keep going back to because it seems to work. So this is about didactics. So you're booked to do some sort of teaching session, often for medical students. And we do these frequently. There's some classic lecture you're supposed to give. That is such a snooze fest. It's boring for the students. It's boring to teach the same topic over and over. And then how to make it interesting. Some of my colleagues will do flipped classroom. They'll record something and then they'll bring a mannequin or whatever. I am a huge advocate of squeaky toys and candy, and this is my version of gamification. Thank you, Lara, for the smile. So when I have to do one of these boring lectures and the students come and they're tired and they're postprandial and they've had like, lots and lots of boring lectures in their life, I say, hey, get into small groups. We're going to have a little competition here and friendly game. And then all the content of the lecture I put into a little game. I give squeaky toys, so people can't just put their hand up. They can't shout out the answer. They have to do the squeaky toy, which makes everybody laugh. It's a little lighter. And then they compete for a jar of candy, which seems to motivate medical students at a 10 out of 10 level. And so that's my go-to. And it works.
I'm going to summarize that as the Pavlovian approach to medical students. I'm not sure if they're going to love that interpretation, but okay, sure.
So the teaching approach, that I really enjoy and that I kind of long for is going all the way back to my graduate days when I was a graduate student in the humanities. And we used to have these hours-long sessions where all we did was debate and discuss and have contentious ideas and do all those sorts of things. And interestingly, they often started around 5 o'clock. And then the next thing you know, it would be 7, and then the conversation would move to a pub somewhere and drinks and food, and it would just be hours and hours of talk and thought and discussion, and the professor always came. And so I do kind of miss that. Though the one thing I'll say, Jason, you reminded me of something I used to do, and maybe I'll bring it back one day, but I used to make a bingo card for my learners of key ideas. And when we had gone through because I don't always plan my discussions, I just sort of go. And so the idea was when they could fill up the bingo card and yell bingo, we were done.
So, like you, I detest formal didactic one-way lectures, and I really like the group discussion-y type of things. So much that, along with a colleague, we actually wrote a paper many, many years ago on the interactive lecture, how to make them more interesting. So I think lectures can be made more interactive and more interesting. If I were to pick one of my favorite ways of teaching, it would be a debate. But actually, unlike Lara, yours sound like yours were informal. I love formal debates. And it really depends on the question and who's moderating the debate to keep us on track. And probably a little bit of pre-discussion, not to script things, but just so, again, we can keep on track and make it a learning point.
Okay, so we've heard some ideas around teaching innovations, mostly things that have been successful for us. And part of the challenge we have as both students and as teachers, we've been in the game for so long that the habits we've adopted, some of them are great. Some of them are supported by theory and by evidence. Others are just there because they've been there. So is it an issue of survivorship bias? So I'm going to bring to you what I'm calling a survey or a micro-monograph, meaning it's kind of like, here's all the things that you can think about around teaching. The study is entitled A Review on Modern Teaching and Learning Techniques in Medical Education from the EIKI Journal of Effective Teaching and Methods in January of this year. The first author is Carcara et al., who are colleagues from Trinity Medical Sciences University in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean. Shout out to that medical school. Please come and invite me to come and learn about your teaching methods.
Only after they invite me. I want to go first.
Any months of January, February, and March in Canada, I'd be very available. So here is the purpose. I'm going to quote the authors to discuss and analyze different teaching learning methods in contemporary medical education. They call this a review. It's a synthesis of predefined instructional methods. I'm going to leave some space for us to discuss what kind of review or what kind of synthesis is. But essentially they do a systematic search of PubMed. They also separately searched Medline, which I'll just flag for our audience is a sub-domain of PubMed. So if you search PubMed, you don't have to do a separate search of Medline. And then they looked at the gray literature, and here they looked at ResearchGate and Google Scholar using free text search, but they never used any type of mesh headings in PubMed. They restricted their article review from 2000 to 2023, and they only included studies that were peer-reviewed, open access, and it had a sample of more than 150 participants. There's no rationale for why they had that exclusion criteria. That's just there. And so I'll look to Linda, Jason, and Lava to talk to, what do you think about this as a review? What can we learn? What are the limits of such a type of review? And maybe we can have a conversation about how the health professions education literature is starting to think more rigorously or more intentionally, or that there is specific language that's now being applied to the various viewpoints or the ways that you're trying to synthesize literature.
So I'm going to use one of Lara's comments, which is there are a couple of things in here that gave me cause for pause.
That's been copyrighted. You're not allowed to use it.
Oh, dear. All right.
It's
Well,
okay. She'll buy
I'm
me a drink the next time we're together. That's every time you use it. You just got to buy me a beer.
Perfect. You just keep track because we'll see each other in a couple of months. And I'll be probably getting you very drunk. So one of the inclusion criteria was that the papers had to be open access. And to me, that cuts down on a lot of papers. Having said that, if they felt they got enough papers, that's fine. But as we get to the results, we'll see they really didn't have that many. And when they were broken up into categories, there may have been one or two per category. So I'm not sure whether this is complete. Therefore, I think, okay, a narrative review used very loosely would address this.
It's kind of a funny paper in the method section. Let's be honest. And that's not the value of this paper going forward. I agree, John, you can't call it systematic. It had funny search strategy, funny inclusion-exclusion criteria. The open access one stood out. The sample of greater than 150 stood out. There's just a whole bunch of things in their choices. I was wondering if the open access thing had to do with their institution's access to journals. I was wondering if that's a strategic choice for them or for their readers. I wasn't sure. But basically, it wasn't systematic, and I wasn't sure about why they chose certain papers for certain methods. And maybe it's neither here nor there. That's not the value.
Let me just add that the sample of 150 strikes me that these people may be coming from a basic science lecture the whole class type of context, because that would exclude almost all clinical teaching. And they do talk, as we'll hear about, some methods that could be used in the clinical setting, but with over 150, that gives me, and here you go, another beer, Lara, cause for pause.
Okay, so I'm not going to reiterate the critiques, but because one of the things that's interesting about this paper, and I thought we'd spend just 1 minute on it, is the idea of the search terms. Because the search terms of this paper, they had 7 search terms that they used. And they searched for medical education, learning techniques, team-based learning, problem-based learning, case-based learning, evidence-based learning. And then some of their categories were team-based learning, problem-based learning, case-based learning. So your search terms drive what you find. But I think the point here is that your search terms are really important, but they're also incredibly hard to build because you want breadth. You want to find all the relevant material, but you need specificity. You only want the relevant material. So how do you go about doing that? Number one, your best friend's a librarian. Every time. Just can't say enough about those information scientists. They are vitally important. But I thought I'd offer just a quick tip on how I go about building my first draft of my search terms, but when I'm going to talk to a librarian. So this isn't a magic answer. This is not anybody's documented excellent methodology. This is what Varpio does when she's got to start somewhere. So the first thing I do is it's an iterative process. The first thing I do is I find 4, 5, 6 papers that I absolutely know should be included. These manuscripts are right the sweet spot of things I want. And then I find 5 or 6 papers that really have, this is not within the scope of what I want. They're adjacent. They're not irrelevant, completely, but they're not within the circle of things I want. And then you do that deconstruction work of trying to figure out the words that are in the papers you do want and not the ones that are in the papers you don't want. And then when you run your first search, you turn those into key topics, you turn those into your mesh terms. And once you conduct your first search, now you have a 2 litmus tests, if you will, because the articles that you really wanted to be included should be found. They should be identified. And the articles that were adjacent but not particularly relevant should not be included. And so that's when now we're into this iterative process of trying to figure out why did that miss the ones I want versus why did it capture the ones I didn't. I mention this, dear listener, because if we have one linchpin moment in your literature review, it's your search terms. It's figuring out that I'm getting the right things. So this is how I start my process, because once I can start doing that iteration, once I'm working with a skilled librarian, it's a lot easier if you go in with a bit of a sense of what you're trying to get, what you're trying not to get, and then you use those 2 piles of papers as litmus tests for your original search.
Part of the reason I chose this paper was to talk a little bit about where syntheses and the categorization of syntheses are going in health professions education. And this is where there's a plug that has a bit of conflict interest for both Lara and myself. We're part of a project. It's called Literature Reviews Explained. There's a link to the site in the abstract for this episode. So go to paperspodcast.com and you can find the link. See how we're just gamifying the whole system where you go to all the things that Lara and I want you to read. And a shout out to Dina Hamza, who's been really one of the leads in that project and making this work.
Yes, Dina Hamza.
And there, I think in a very nice way, it talks about 8 categorizations for different types of syntheses. And we're not meant to say these are the only 8, but I think these are where the field is starting to move. 20 years ago, the differentiation of what was a synthesis was you were a meta-analysis or you weren't. And that's being deconstructed. But it means, though, that we need to be thoughtful when we talk about what type of synthesis are we. The authors just say they're a review. And probably a decision editor should push back on them and say, what type of methodology, what type of approach are you using? And give us the label so that there is a common pre-existing, or you're signaling to the audience, this is how I'm going to tackle it. For example, is this a narrative review? They talk about what their synthesis or their search is. We've heard some critiques of it, but they miss 2 really fundamental points. They never talk about this is who we are. This is the reflexivity statement that talks about here's who we are, here's how we're going to approach this, this is the perspective we're going to take. I think the 150 participants says that they're looking for so-called big studies that offer objective so-called truth. That would be my interpretation from a breadcrumb there. The second part of narrative review has to say is, here's how I'm going to try to organize the literature. I'm going to try to make an argument about here's where the literature is, here's where it is not, and here's where it might need to go from the perspective that I'm taking. And what we really find more is that this feels a little bit more like a monograph of, here's a survey. If you want all of the instructional methods that we included, here's a little snapshot of what they are. It's not offering a synthesis that takes all the literature and has a meta inference that comes out of it. So I would direct our audience to start thinking a bit more. When we say a review, what do we mean? And what kind of review are we doing? How are we trying to synthesize and make a coherent argument of where the literature is? And there's a whole bunch of different approaches. One last shout out to Javid Sukhera, who wrote a great paper on narrative reviews in JGME. And that's really the basis for the section at Literature Reviews Explained. So I've shouted out enough. Let's go to the results. They only found 25 articles. They had pretty limited inclusion criteria, and they included 10 in their synthesis. They identify 11 instructional methods. I'm going to talk you through them quickly, and I'm going to ask Lara, Jason, Linda to identify one of those methods and unpack it a little bit more as to why they think it's great, why they think it won't work in some contexts, and how they perhaps have used it. So the 11 methods, and this is a teaser for you, a listener, to say, hey, maybe I want to pull this manuscript, or should I go to Papers Podcast, pull the abstract, where we have condensed this all into a really nice table. It's a 12 by 4 table. So there's 48 cells for you to read.
It's
so here's
the listeners can't see you dancing about your 12 by 4 table.
The numbers make him happy.
I did a lot of work putting together that table, I will tell you. Thank you, GPT. All right. Case-based learning, where you use a real or hypothetical case as a stimulus. Evidence-based medicine, which is to ask a question and do a clinical query and critique the literature supporting it. Problem-based learning, it's student-led based on a problem with small group kind of facilitation. Simulation-based learning, where you mimic typically a procedure or a team-based interaction and have an opportunity to practice and receive feedback. Social media and e-learning, the use of various digital resources allowing a flexibility of delivery and asynchronous learning. Peer tutoring, using near peers to help teach and share and to coach one another. Observational learning, where probably the most profound thing we do as teachers is by how we act and how we're observed. Team-based learning, a structure often where you ladder various levels of learner into the work of solving a question or a problem, and they do it in a collaborative way. Flipped classroom, Jason talked about that briefly at the opening, where you do the lecture at home and then you come to class to do the homework with the teacher. Virtual reality and artificial reality type of learning, typically seeing only really in anatomy and in surgical procedural learning. Here currently in HPE, where you give an immersive interactive environment where you're allowed to see things in ways that go beyond kind of typical visual spatial types of learning. And then the last is gamification, where you introduce the idea of points and competition to enhance motivation. I think that's something about Jason's candy and squeaky toys. So over to you, co-hosts. What stood out for you? Unpack it for us.
So team-based learning is the one I picked because it's super fun. It was introduced to me by Paul Hydett and Ruth Levine, who came to visit when I was still living and working in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And I had the best time. So team-based learning is built on 4 foundational principles, 4 foundational ideas. So number 1, learning in teams is importantly different and beneficial for learning, but those teams need to be carefully formed and managed. Principle 2 is that students need to be held accountable for the quality of their individual and group work. 3 is that students need frequent and timely feedback. And 4 is that team assignments should promote both learning and team development. So when you put those 4 together, those foundational principles, you can bring a team-based learning to life in many different ways. But team-based learning has a set of techniques that they suggest. And those techniques involve pre-class preparation. There's a fair bit of expectation on that. Then individual readiness tests in the classroom, and then team readiness tests, some in-class feedback and clarification sessions, and then group problem solving. But those are just techniques that are traditionally held. They are the ones from the canonical team-based learning texts, but you can modify them. There's room for movement in there. But as these authors in this article point out, team-based learning can enable different educators from different orientations to collaborate in teaching. So you can have your basic scientist educator as well as a clinician educator actively working together. And it's a great way to bridge theory and practice. So the learners have to come with perhaps with some theory in mind, and then in the classroom, they have to apply it. So it's really, I really do love team-based learning. One word of caution, it requires that you as educators are savvy managers of group dynamics, because it is a group-based learning activity. So if there's one person dominating the conversation, or if there's one person who's just not saying anything at all, these are things you have to actively work against. So the importance of building your student teams and being able, as an educator, to manage those group dynamics are really important.
So I'm going to pick sim. So simulation-based learning, love this topic. It's a whole world. I am not a master of sim. There are people who are gurus of sim in my center. Glenn Posner, who runs our sim center, Andrew Hall, who's a researcher of sim, and lots are wonderful practitioners. So they define it as using high fidelity simulations, mannequins, equipment, or virtual equivalent to replicate clinical settings, allowing students to practice skills and a controlled environment without risking patient safety. So that's the wonderful, powerful premise of sim. There's a reason why sports, the military, astronauts, like everybody uses sim, because it really works well for the human brain. You get to try on something that is close to an authentic type setting and scenario and do it over and over again until you're good. So the advantage of this is that you get hands-on practice, which our brain loves. It's interactive, active, without patient risk. Allows repeated practice, so you get that mastery learning element, and can build confidence. And you can do this as groups or an individual. The downside that's in the paper is that this costs a lot of money and you need extra training. I think there's a spectrum of sim available. I do sim when I teach medical students an intro to trauma. So ABCs and putting on collars and a little bit about airway and so on. You can do that with very little cost. And it's really hands-on. It's really fun. And I can see the difference when I see that med student back in the emerge department out of the sim center, applying what we've learned. So just loved me some sim.
I just want to say you can do low-cost sim. Wasn't it Jeff Norman who had a paper once about doing really is simulation with like a styrofoam cup and some pencils and whatever, and the results showed that the learners gained skill. So yeah.
Yeah, it's not Jeff. It's Stan Hamstra was the senior.
Oh, that's who it was.
And is Eddie Matsumoto doing it for his thesis.
So cool. Styrofoam cup, right? Like, dude.
I'll promo Eddie Matsumoto, who is a surgical educator in my shop.
Oh, way to go.
All right. So, the other part of sim, just to carry on this conversation, is the part where you're simulating communication skills or teamwork that doesn't demand high fidelity, or task trainers. And they kind of missed out on this. I had trouble choosing here. It's kind of like minestrone soup. So in minestrone soup, you've got a whole bunch of ingredients, and they come together to make this wonderful meal. And you start with some things. You start with the onions and the garlic, and then you add a few things in later, and that, depending on the amount of time it takes to cook, etc. So it's the same here. There are a whole bunch of interventions here. And whether you like the carrots in the soup or the pasta in the soup is really depends on a lot of things. It depends on who your audience is and the number of people in your audience. And the problem I've got here is that in some cases, some of these teaching techniques are meant for smaller groups, bigger groups, individuals, etc. The other thing I'm a little bit confused about is that I don't lump things together the same way they do. I wouldn't mix social media and e-learning. I would expand on simulation, for instance. So I have trouble picking
Agree,
one.
Linda.
Yeah.
It's a funny slice.
Yeah, it's a funny way of slicing it. So I have trouble picking one thing out here. Having said that, if I had to pick one, I'd probably pick the flipped classroom. Just for fun, because I think it's fairly clearly explained here. And it is something that can be used in my setting. You don't have to have 150 students to do it. You can do it in a much smaller group.
Welcome back to the Cooking Podcast, where we will get you in 20 minutes or less a delicious homemade meal.
Or fast food.
Before we go to our round of votes, I do want to highlight another element that I thought was really nice from this manuscript. They created a mini infographic that explains each of these 11 instructional methods. You could dispute how you like the clumping or the sorting or the dividing, but the mini infographics are under a Creative Commons license, and the license allows you to reproduce them and adapt them. So if you are looking for a nice way to pull out a whole bunch of images and put together in a nice little survey for an introductory train the teacher kind of workshop or a resident as teacher kind of workshop, most of that work has been done for you here. Here's a conclusion from the authors, and then I'll get some concluding thoughts from the hosts. They quote, "Flexibility is key in medical education, and our curriculum should be adaptable enough to accommodate and incorporate multidisciplinary teaching models effectively and contextually. We advocate for an adaptable and student-centered approach in medical education, recognize the evolving nature of the learning process and the unique needs of individual learners." That's certainly a conclusion I can get behind. So let's go to our round of votes. What's the impact of this paper for you? Linda, Lara, Jason.
If you look at my personal impact, I don't think it's very high. So I'm going to adjust your question to what is the impact of this paper for a certain group of people. And that group of people, I think, would be teachers who are just starting out, possibly those who teach a lot in large groups. And I think for that group of people, I'd give this a 3. It does give you a taste. It gives you a tasting menu, if we're going to continue the food analogy. for somebody who's already an experienced teacher who's used some of these methods, I think it doesn't go far enough, hence the 3.
For the exact same reasons, Linda, I'm going to give this paper a 3 as well. Exactly the same reasons. It's really useful for that, for those of clinician educators who are new to the process, trying to hit the ground running, understand the landscape. Perfect. 3.
You guys are so generous today. This paper is got lots of challenges on the method side, and the content's not super new, and there are other better sources for the content. But here is the real value of this paper. This paper is all about the infographics, as John mentioned. So if you have a presentation or you're talking to somebody about a method, the infographics is a great way to start. And it's if you're teaching a class like to novices and health professions education about methods, the infographics are of pretty good value. So I'm going to give it a 2 for that.
I'm going to give it a 3. I wanted to have a conversation around the different types of synthesis that are coalescing in the HPE literature. And the methodology they employ there is challenging if it leads to conclusions that are evocative or push our thinking. But when they're simply trying to say, hey, let's do a survey of a bunch of teaching methods and offer you an explanation and where they work well and where they don't, I don't think that there is a great flaw, because this is assembling a lot of material that probably each of us, if asked to describe flipped classroom, we'd probably just start from scratch and write it and would never actually look to a reference. And so I don't think the challenges in the methods warrant a dismissal of the findings, which is a survey of 11, potentially arbitrary, certainly not exhaustive, different types of instructional methods. And I think if you took the table that you can create from this, or you took the infographics that are available, and you gave it day 1 to the resident as teacher, or day 1 to the clinical teacher workshop, and said, okay, here's a survey of a bunch of stuff. This will get you into the shallow end, and you will then need to build on this, realize there's more than instructional methods, realize you'll need more information to dive into each of these methods by themselves. That's a way to go. This is not a synthesis of all the simulation-based learning, because there are 3 journals right off the top of my head that I can think of that are solely dedicated to simulation-based education. And so how would you even organize all of that literature all by itself? It's the survey. And so for that reason, I think it's pretty reasonable. Listeners, you can debate with us about the merit of this topic in this episode. Authors, Carcara, and all, you can reach me for my free workshop. You tell me you want a gamification, you want a PBL, I'll bring any of it on my own dime. If you can get me into the Caribbean sometime in the Canadian winter, I think that'd be great.
You're schlepping now, John.
No, I am schlepping right now. Please get me out of Canadian winter. But you can reach us at thepaperspodcast@gmail.com or at the internet, paperpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
Take care, everybody.
You've been listening to the Papers Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody. Thank you for all you do. Take care.